I want to start with a record, not a dramatic one. A municipal engineering report filed in London in 1857, the kind of document that sits in archive boxes and nobody reads for 100 years. A hydraulic survey conducted during the early phase of the Metropolitan Board of Works, the body responsible for modernising London's drainage infrastructure. The surveyor, a civil engineer named William Hayward, noted in Appendix C of that report something that was not followed up on in the main text: that several of the buried watercourses beneath central London showed evidence of channel modification that predated, in his estimation, any known period of organised construction in the city. He used the phrase, not the work of any tradesman we know of. That phrase sat in Appendix C of an archived report for over 100 years. Then I found the same phrase, not translated, not paraphrased, in a different language, in a different archive from a different country. And then a third. And that was when I understood that what was being described in London in 1857 was not a local anomaly. It was one piece of a much larger and much more carefully managed silence. If you've been following this series, you'll know that we've been building a picture, slowly, carefully, across multiple continents and centuries, of a pattern. Not a theory, a pattern. The kind that doesn't ask you to believe anything, only to look at what is already in the record and notice what the record refuses to look back at. In our last episode, we examined what may be the most significant biological infrastructure on Earth. The food forest systematically reclassified as wilderness across Europe, Asia and the Americas in the same compressed historical window. This episode, we go underground, because beneath every major city on Earth there is water, and beneath the infrastructure we built to manage that water, there is older infrastructure, older than the cities above it, older in many cases than the civilizations we credit with founding those cities. And in case after case after case, access to that older infrastructure was restricted, sealed or reclassified within a window that by now should be very familiar to you. Let's start in London, because London is where the documentary record is most visible, partly because England maintains some of the most systematically archived municipal records in the world, and partly because London's underground geography has been studied by enough independent researchers that the anomalies are difficult to contain within the official narrative. There are, depending on which map you consult, between 13 and 21 rivers flowing beneath London. The Fleet, the Walbrook, the Effra, the Tyburn, the Westbourne, the Neckinger, and others whose names appear in medieval records and then vanish from official maps in the same period, the 1850s through the 1880s. The official explanation is that these rivers were buried during the Victorian expansion of London's sewer system under Joseph Bazalgette. Industrialisation turned them into open sewers, and they were enclosed for public health reasons. This is true, this is documented. I want to be honest about that. But here is where the official explanation begins to strain. The Walbrook River, which runs beneath the City of London, the financial district, was not buried in the 1850s. It was already underground when the Romans arrived in the 1st century. The Romans built above it. They did not bury it. It was already there. And the channel the Romans found when they established Londinium was not a natural watercourse in the sense that we mean when we say natural. It was shaped. The bedrock on either side of the channel shows evidence of modification. The gradient was not accidental. Someone had managed the flow, directed it, made it useful, before anyone we can officially name was present to do that work. Who? The academic literature on the Walbrook notes the anomaly, and then moves on to questions that have easier answers. Now we travel to Istanbul, Constantinople, Byzantium, a city so layered with history that even professional historians sometimes lose track of which era they're excavating. Beneath Istanbul there is a cistern most tourists visit. The Basilica cistern, Yerebatan Sarai, the sunken palace, lit dramatically, photographed constantly, explained clearly as a Byzantine construction from the 6th century under Emperor Justinian. That explanation is probably accurate for that cistern. But the basilica cistern is not alone. It sits above and beside and between dozens of others, at least 92 of which have been formally identified, many of which have not been fully mapped, and some of which show construction details that the Byzantine attribution does not comfortably explain. In several of the smaller cisterns in the Sultanate district, the column bases sit on platforms carved from a single continuous piece of stone. The scale of the individual stone elements, their weight, their precise fitting, the absence of the mortar-dependent construction that characterizes Byzantine engineering. These details have been noted by structural archaeologists working in the city. They have been noted in technical journals, and then, with a reliability that by now you should recognize, absorbed, published, peer-reviewed, cited, and quietly left to sit at the edge of the frame while the main narrative continues undisturbed. And here's where it becomes impossible to ignore. Istanbul sits at the intersection of two continental water systems. The Bosphorus connects the Black Sea to the Marmara. The geological survey of the Bosphorus seabed, conducted comprehensively for the first time as part of a natural gas pipeline survey in the early 2000s, found something that was briefly exciting to researchers and then very quickly ceased to be discussed in public geological literature. The seabed channels show evidence of large-scale hydraulic modification inconsistent with the last several thousand years of geological activity. The channels were shaped, at scale, by something. And then the geological conversation about the Bosphorus moved on to the pipeline. The modification was noted. The question of who modified it and when was not followed to a conclusion. The silence was deafening. Let me take you to Tehran. This is where the picture begins to clarify. Iran is home to the qanat, one of the most sophisticated water engineering systems in human history. Underground channels sloping gently toward population centers driven by gravity, ventilated by vertical shafts, capable of delivering water from mountain aquifers to desert settlements across distances of 50 kilometers or more. The oldest operating qanats are conservatively dated to approximately 3,000 years ago. They are still functioning. People still drink from them. And the engineers who maintain them today, many of them inheriting knowledge passed generation to generation, cannot always explain how the original gradient calculations were made. Because the precision of those calculations, the degree to which the builders anticipated subsurface geology across dozens of kilometers, exceeds what we understand to be the surveying capability of the civilizations we attribute them to. This raises a simple but critical question. If the qanat network of Iran represents the limits of what was possible 3,000 years ago, what does the presence of qanat-adjacent infrastructure in cities that predate the Persian Empire by millennia tell us about who came before? Because there is evidence, documented in Iranian geological surveys conducted in the 1970s and largely unpublished in Western academic literature, of channel systems beneath the oldest qanat networks that are older still. Systems that the qanat builders appear to have found and built above, incorporating where useful, apparently without knowing what they were incorporating. The same way the Romans found the Walbrook and built above it without explaining it. Think about that. A civilization builds a water system. Another civilization, centuries later, builds above and around the first, incorporating it without identifying its origin. And we, arriving last, seal both beneath concrete and the confident narrative of municipal engineering history. Let me step back and name the anomaly clearly. Individually, each case has an explanation. The Walbrook was a natural river modified by early inhabitants. The Byzantine cisterns were built on Roman foundations. The Iranian sub-qanat infrastructure is pre-Persian, but still within the range of human possibility. Any one of these fits inside the accepted frame, if you're willing to press it a little. What doesn't fit is what we're about to look at now, the coordination between approximately 1850 and 1895, across an extraordinary range of cities and administrative systems with no visible mechanism of coordination in the documentary record. The following things happened. In London, the Metropolitan Board of Works began the systematic enclosure of underground watercourses. The process generated thousands of pages of engineering documentation held at the London Metropolitan Archives. Among them are survey notes describing, in language that becomes careful at precisely the moments when it should become specific, pre-existing channel modifications of unknown origin. That careful, hedged language appears in the engineering record, and then it stops appearing. In Paris, the systematic expansion of the catacombs inspection program in the 1860s produced maps of the subterranean chalk quarries beneath the city. Some of those maps, held in the less accessible sections of the Archives Nationales, show channel systems in the lower quarry levels that do not connect to any known water source and do not correspond to any known engineering project. They are noted in the maps. They are not discussed in the accompanying reports. A cartographer who notices something anomalous and chooses not to discuss it in print is making a decision. What was that decision based on? In New York, the Croton Aqueduct project of the 1840s and its subsequent expansion involved extensive subsurface mapping of Manhattan. The geological surveys conducted in preparation for the water tunnel projects found artesian pressure systems beneath the island at depths and with characteristics the geological models of the time struggled to explain. The water in certain locations was already moving, already channeled, already under pressure in ways that required explanation and did not receive it. There are engineers' field notes from the second Croton project in the 1880s, held in the New York Public Library's map division, that describe in the margins what one surveyor calls organized stone at depth, stone below the frost line, below any known period of habitation on the island, shaped in a manner inconsistent with natural formation. Those notes have sat in that archive for 140 years. The phrase organized stone at depth appears in them and does not appear in any formal report that followed. In Vienna, in Melbourne, in Buenos Aires, cities with no administrative connection to each other, no obvious reason to coordinate. The same window, 1850 to 1895, produced the same archival signature. Detailed documentation up to a certain depth, careful imprecision below it. This is the coordination problem again. Not one city, not one anomaly. A pattern distributed across the globe within the same historical window producing the same result. Acknowledgement without investigation, the record that begins specifically and goes quiet at exactly the point where specificity would matter most. Now, I want to introduce you to a name you may not know. Nikolai Umov, Russian physicist, early theorist of energy flow in physical systems. In the 1880s, a man deeply interested in the behavior of water under pressure in confined geological formations. He was not a hydrologist. He was a physicist who had noticed something in the properties of underground water systems that interested him beyond their engineering utility. His papers from this period, held in the archives of Moscow State University and not widely translated, describe what he called resonant channel behavior, the tendency of certain underground water systems to transmit what he characterized as organized pressure patterns across distances that simple hydraulic physics cannot account for. He believed, and he committed this to paper in 1884, that certain underground water systems were not passive conduits, that they were, in some meaningful physical sense, he could not yet quantify, active, that they were doing something. He submitted a proposal to the Imperial Academy of Sciences for funding to investigate the phenomenon systematically. The proposal was declined. The decline letter, which also exists in the Moscow archive, is brief and gives no specific scientific objection. The research stopped. Umov moved on to other work. The question he was asking, what are these systems doing, was not asked again in institutional scientific literature for several decades. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Let me bring in something from a different direction, because water is not only infrastructure. Water is information. This is not a mystical claim. It is a basic property of hydraulic systems that pressure differentials encode and transmit mechanical information. Engineered water systems, particularly those with precision-controlled gradients and multiple interconnected channels, are capable of functioning as communication infrastructure. Not in a digital sense, in the sense that a change in one part of the system produces predictable, measurable effects across the whole. The hydraulic civilization of Angkor managed water across a landscape of 1,000 square kilometers with a precision that modern hydraulic engineers have described as extraordinary. The qanat engineers of Persia understood properties of subsurface water behavior that we are still modeling. And here is the question that the accumulated evidence begins to suggest. What if the underground water systems beneath our cities are not relics, not inert infrastructure sitting abandoned in the dark? What if they are still doing something, still transmitting, still maintaining, still running whatever logic was built into them before the cities above were placed there? I cannot prove this. I want to be very clear about that. But I want to hold the question open long enough to feel its weight. Because when you place it alongside everything we've examined, the Walbrook-shaped channels, the sub-qanat systems of Iran, the organized stone at depth beneath Manhattan, the resonant behavior Umov noticed and was discouraged from investigating, a different picture forms than the one we were given. A picture of a hydraulic infrastructure distributed globally, old enough that multiple subsequent civilizations built above it without identifying its origin, sophisticated enough that some incorporated it into their own engineering without understanding what they were incorporating, and managed with enough institutional consistency that when it was rediscovered in the mid-19th century, the response was not curiosity, it was closure. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And then there is the final piece, the one I keep returning to. In every major city, there are points where access to the underground water infrastructure is restricted, not by engineering necessity, not by safety protocol alone, by administrative designation with no clear expiration and no clearly stated rationale. In London, sections of the Fleet River Channel below a certain depth have been off-limits to any inspection not sanctioned by Thames Water since a regulatory amendment in 1974 that was not debated publicly. In Paris, the deepest inspection levels, qanats, below the quarry maps, require a ministerial authorization that has been granted to fewer than a dozen researchers in 50 years. In Istanbul, the section of the cistern network abutting the foundations of the Topkapi Palace was sealed in 1923 and has not been formally reopened. In Tehran, there are qanat branches that appear on pre-revolutionary survey maps and do not appear on any map published after 1979. In New York, there is a section of the water tunnel network beneath Lower Manhattan noted as requiring further survey in the 1930s, whose survey, to my knowledge, has never been completed or published. In each case, a legitimate explanation exists: safety, preservation, national security, bureaucratic backlog. I am not dismissing any of them, but hold them alongside the timing, alongside the archival signature, alongside the pattern that keeps producing the same result in the same kinds of places. Because what these restrictions share, across cities with no mechanism of coordination, across administrative systems and political regimes with nothing else in common, is that they sit precisely above the points where the pre-existing infrastructure is deepest, most intact and least explained. Not all of the underground, not the parts we built, the parts we found. I've spent a long time with this question, longer than is comfortable, and here is what I keep returning to. Not who built the original system, not when it was built, not what event separated it from whoever designed it. The series keeps circling those questions, and I don't pretend to have reached their centre. The question that stops me is simpler than all of that. The water is still moving. In the channels beneath London, in the qanat branches beneath Tehran, in the artesian systems beneath New York that were already under pressure when the first engineers arrived. Whatever the system was built to do, it is doing it, quietly, continuously. In the dark, beneath the foundations of everything we have decided is civilization. And at every point where someone with scientific credentials and institutional access move toward understanding what that system is doing, what it was designed for, whether it might be doing something we have no instruments yet calibrated to detect. The access closed, the funding redirected. The field notes sat in archive boxes. The proposal to the Imperial Academy was declined without stated reason. I am not telling you what to conclude from that pattern. I am asking you to sit with the shape of it. The water moving in the dark beneath every city you have ever lived in. The channels that were already there when the first foundations were poured. The engineers who noticed organized stone at depth and reached for careful language. The physicist who thought the system was active and was told to look somewhere else. And the administrative designations, quiet, legitimate, distributed across a dozen countries with no apparent coordination, sitting precisely above the oldest, deepest and least explained parts of what is, when you step back far enough to see it whole. A single system, a planetary system, still running, still sealed from the people living above it, still waiting, perhaps, for someone to ask the right question in the right place at the right depth. What is it doing down there?